Hello, my friends. Today, we're going to read an excerpt from Raleigh Jefferson's Awesome Friendly Spooky Stories by Jeff Kinney. This chapter is called A Mummy. A long time ago, in ancient Egypt, there lived a pharaoh named Mech. And when Mech died, the royal priests and priestesses wrapped his body to prepare it for the afterlife. But a few thousand years later, some archaeologists from another country discovered Mech's pyramid and took his sarcophagus with them. When Mech woke up, he was disappointed to find out that he was in a museum and not in the afterlife like he'd expected. On top of that, they didn't even put his sarcophagus in a nice spot. So Mech was angry, and he used his mummy powers to make a big mess of things in the museum. But even after Mech destroyed the museum, he wasn't satisfied. So he went outside, and that's where he really did some damage. That night, Mech was all over the news for wrecking the city. Mummy's revenge. Mech was just getting started, though. He went from country to country, destroying everything in his path, and wherever he went, he made headlines. But after a while, Mech ran out of things to destroy, and people started losing interest anyway. Eventually, Mech settled down a little and tried to get used to living in the modern world. And even though he would have rather been in the afterlife, he had to admit that television was a pretty great invention. One night, Mech was watching the news, and there was a story about how some archaeologists made a new discovery in Egypt. They found the tomb of Kaaba, a pharaoh who lived a few thousand years ago. Well, at first Mech started getting angry because this brought back memories of what happened to him. But after a few minutes of deep breathing, he was able to calm down. People were excited about this new discovery because Kaaba's tomb was really glitzy and full of treasures. But everyone was nervous when they opened Kaaba's sarcophagus because no one wanted a repeat of the Mech situation. Things were different this time around, though. First of all, Kaaba was much better preserved than Mech, and Mech was kind of annoyed when the people on the news kept pointing that out. When Kaaba stepped out of his tomb, he didn't just start randomly destroying things. In fact, he seemed curious about the modern world and everything in it. Kaaba started appearing on morning talk shows, and before long, he was everyone's favorite mummy, and Mech never would have admitted he was jealous, but he was. In fact, Kaaba was so popular that people started making all sorts of mummy merchandise and used his image without asking permission. So Kaaba hired a slick lawyer, and before long, all that stuff was shut down. But then Kaaba's lawyer took it a step further. His lawyer trademarked the mummy, which made it so that Kaaba was the only one who could use the name. And then she made a big announcement about it in front of the TV cameras. Well, this really ticked off Mech, who didn't think it was right that Kaaba could do that. Plus, Mech was annoyed that he didn't think of it first. After a while, Kaaba had his own fashion line and kids cereal and even a major motion picture in the works. And everywhere Mech went, there was Kaaba's face. Mech thought it was time for him to cash in on this money craze too. So he started calling himself the original mummy, and he put a few ads out there. But a few weeks later, Mek got a letter from Kaba's lawyer threatening to sue him for everything he owned unless he took down the ads. But this just made Mek mad. Maybe not as mad as when he used to go around destroying cities with his mummy powers, but still pretty mad. So Mek hired a lawyer of his own and sued Kaba to try and stop him from calling himself the mummy, since Mek was famous first. And it was a huge trial, and everyone watched it on TV. Well, Mek didn't have a lot of money, so his lawyer wasn't as slick as Kaba's. And when the trial ended, the judge ruled that Kaba was the winner. Mek had to agree that he'd never use the name the original mummy or the classic mummy or anything like that. In fact, all he was allowed to do was call himself a mummy in lowercase letters. For a while, Mek tried to make some money by calling himself a mummy, but you really can't make any money with a name like that. Mek started working at an amusement park for Friday nights in October. But it wasn't that much fun because it was a lot harder to scare people these days. Mek still wasn't giving up though. He started calling himself the Dead Pharaoh to get around the court agreement, but it turns out there was already a professional wrestler with that name, and Mek just ended up back in court. Things were great for Kaba for a few years, but after a while, the whole mummy act got stale and people stopped going to his movies. Eventually, he got into comedy, but he made a few stinkers, and that was the end of his film career. Then someone claimed they found a big toe in a box of mummy flakes, and Kaba got sued for $1 million. And even though it turned out the person who sued him made the whole thing up, nobody would buy any food products with the word mummy on them after that. Soon Kaba's money started to dry up, and he couldn't afford the fancy lifestyle he was used to. After a while, he had to sell his private jet and his 3 mansions at a discount. Things got even worse when his wife left him and took half his money. Kaba finally hit rock bottom when he had to sell his own sarcophagus. But things started to turn around for Kaba when he ran into his old arch enemy, Mek, who was working as a food baker at the grocery store. The 2 mummies got to talking, and it turned out they had a lot more in common than they thought. Kaba and Mek became friends, and after a while, Kaba moved into Mek's apartment. And even though they didn't always get along as roommates, the one thing they agreed on was that television really was a pretty great invention. The end.